Are we in a modern dark ages? Are we facing a condition such as a societal collapse or a failure in leadership that will cause hardships for years to come? I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody with this. I do believe we're in a modern dark age, and I'll define what a dark age is, and I'll talk about some of the challenges we face here. But what we're really about here with Inside Strategic Relations is how to use strategic relationships in order to mitigate difficult situations. So, if you seek wisdom, it'll serve you. If you seek emotions, it'll carry you away. If you seek novelty, you will be seduced by it, and only wisdom gives you a sense to move forward. That's the foundation of what we're talking about here. Now, when in society wisdom no longer leads, and very often you're led by emotions, very often you're led by novelty, and we see the novelty in the social media platforms, we see the emotions and how people are addressing political issues rather than working on solutions. We fail as a society, and I'm going to argue that's a biological function of large groups. But again, as Socrates said, the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. When you have critical thinking and when you have the ability to discern truth from falsehood, you have the knowledge to know that you aren't the expert in everything. You can have a specialized area. Now, when your specialized area is the ability to think and the ability to apply that thinking in building quality, mutually beneficial relationships, you too may believe that we're in a dark ages. A dark ages is when you have a significant decline in economic, intellectual, or otherwise cultural decline. So you have this wisdom, you're able to seek the truth with a critical mind, you're able to deduce how ideas and understand how the world really works, and then you see the world and it's like a clown show. It's like, oh my gosh, like how could that have been a good thing? Why would you do that? um, and again, what we're going to talk about here is how to make this work in your benefit, because if we truly are in a dark age, it isn't going to get better, or it'll get worse before it gets better. And it could take, instead of 3 to 5 years, which you could face in a recession or an economic challenge, it could take 300 to 400 years before things get back as good as they may have been for a brief period of time. Now, first, understand this. I am not saying that historically things were better. What I'm saying is that there's a ebb and flow of how society works, and that these dark ages come and go over time. So let's work first on the definition of the dark ages. First off, it is a loss of historical content. So if you're now in an environment where people are saying this is how it was in the past, and then when you look at the facts, it actually, history books are being rewritten, context is being lost, movies are even portraying historical events in completely different ways, that is a loss of historical context. That is what happens in the dark ages. Sometimes this is propaganda, and sometimes this is just honestly the people don't know how to do any research. You start seeing historical characters disappear. So historical characters are then simplified and then they disappear. Like Robert E. Lee, they simplify him as a Confederate general and as a slave owner, and then they ignore the latter parts of his life. Booker T. Washington, for example, some people say Booker T. Washington was a sellout, but if you actually read his books, he's actually lifting people up. Again, this is meant to be a brief podcast. We could go into specific examples for each of them. But the next thing that happens in the Dark Ages is a rise of feudalism. Now, feudalism is where you kind of don't have your own personal. So rather than an individual owning property, it's individuals becoming property. Now, this could be in slavery, but it could also be as simple as someone owning a big piece of land, and everybody who lives on that piece of land has to follow the rules of the owner, or they have to pay certain tribute to that owner. And you can see how this in technology, how technology can monetize the attention, or how large populations become a ward of the state. As these individuals are on welfare, for example, they are have heavy restrictions that tend to keep them on welfare rather than helping them gain the independence that is necessary for them to move up the social economic scales. Another challenge is ongoing wars and plagues. Now, this goes beyond the latest health scare, and if you go beyond the headlines, you'll see that there are outbreaks all the time. So the news is screaming about COVID and bird flu and influenza and bubonic plague are still actual things. Now you can, if you have wisdom, you can go to the CDC's website, you can look at their databases, and you can understand that there are constant plagues going on. But what I'm talking about here is these war on COVID, the war on drugs, the war on where we take the problem and we raise it up so high that is now we've dedicated an overwhelming amount of resources on those. That happens in a dark ages. There's two more elements here. Number one, the next element is religious superstition defining thinking. Now I'm not just talking about the Abrahamic religions here or other religious contexts where you have ritual. What I'm talking about is superstitious thinking or fear that motivates action. So there's a belief or a right think that starts to get developed, and if you're outside of that, there's an inquisition to correct you. So cancel culture is a religious or a cult-like aspect that impacts society. And when we have a lot of that, where people are doing it by faith alone, and forcing their ideas upon other people, going on crusades, that is a sign that you're in the dark ages. So are you checking these things off? Because these are happening. The last one is prices go up and quality goes down. So this can be a factor of inflation, but it can also be that the drive for low cost goods across the country. So society is going really well. People start driving for low cost goods. More people want to be involved in the material elements of life. And what happens is now instead of having clothing made out of natural fibers, which last years, you end up with clothing that's made out of recycled plastic bottles that degrade with every wash. See, the concept of a dark ages, while it was coined in the 1300s after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is actually a condition that exists throughout human history. So it's kind of a collective humans just stop thinking and their society starts to fail. So I'll give you a couple examples of this, just the timeline in general. And again, if you want to go into these in more detail, I do have a more complex presentation, a more detailed presentation. But again, I'm telling you the history is not as important as the steps that you'll take, and I'll give you some steps to recover at least your family and your community from this dark ages. But again, there were other crashes other than what happened in the post Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Dark Ages in the 7th and 8th century, the Bronze Age collapse in 1200 BC, the Greek Dark Ages between 1100 BC and 750 BC, just to name a few. Now, if you step out of the Eurocentric view, there were Dark Ages seen after the collapse of the Mayan Empire or the Mayan civilization and Easter Island. I truly believe that Dark Ages is a biological functions of civilizations that is an error in response to natural disaster, foreign invasion or mass migration, economic depression, disease outbreaks, or internal strife. As a collective, I am seeing that humans do not think very well. So as you get into a larger group, large percentages of that group will just stop thinking because they'll just follow what they're told to do. And ultimately, we now have a centralization of thought and decision, which then small errors become larger. And you're going to see why this is important as we give you the steps to take. The good news is that you're in a unique position to thrive even as the world is collapsing. You might recognize that there's some clown world like activities going on and some missteps. Um, it is not, and this is a quote from Ellen Glasgow, what happens is not as important as how you react to what happens. See, media is going to stoke these fears. History repeats itself. When you start having cult like followings to celebrity or conflicting ideas or this kind of doublespeak, media and technology have figured out a way to monetize this. So the media is going to create a constant state of fear. The more you fear, the more you consume. That consumption is that feudalization of you won't own anything, you'll just rent everything you have. Do you remember the days you could buy a record and it was your record for all eternity? Today, you're literally renting music. So your entertainment is on a pay-per-view basis, rather than even having that entertainment within your community as something you could experience with a group of people. You Too many people today have become slaves of something rather than having the personal freedom in all things that they do. Now, again, personal freedom isn't about being able to do anything you want. Certainly can't harm other people in your own freedoms, but ultimately, it's sometimes freedom of speech is even difficult, and too many fear to speak up. So again, what are we going to do about this dark ages? Because I don't want to add to that fear, anxiety, that all that, if it's unresolved, creates depression, and it makes you become this giant sucking vacuum of my life is miserable, so therefore I must have this product. Consumption is not the solution. In fact, very often, when you consume without thinking, you're reinforcing the elements that create the dark ages itself. You're adding to the collapse. Now, I'm not going to talk about, again, I'm going to give you 6 steps that you can take to address this. I'm not going to go into deep detail. And the reason I'm not going to go into detail is because this is a podcast. If you want me to do a full presentation on that, and you want me to talk specific strategies on how to survive this dark age and actually thrive, even if the world around you is failing, be sure to visit www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Go to the contact page and just ask questions related to the dark ages, or how to address this, or anything I've covered here, and I will be more than happy to go into details. But let's talk steps and factors you can establish in order to thrive in the dark ages. First off, is you want to form alternative communities. So when a large population of people make bad decisions, usually in a central environment, they make bad decisions, the impact is multiplied over the volume of the group. So if you create smaller alternative community groups, you're going to be able to have better control and better uh, kind of a cultivation in that. Now, if there are 10 or 15 different alternative groups and they're not infighting each other, they can create the outcomes that they're looking for, and they can do so in a way that you can borrow the best practices. So it's the difference between one centralized federal government that makes all the decisions for the people versus 50 states who have individual governments and have the flexibility to make decisions within their territories, and then ultimately rolls up into some federal government that is there to primarily resolve conflicts. In other environments, it's a representative democracy. Now, I'm not saying this is the only solution, but again, even in your hometown, such as the Amish, the Mennonites, or other types of small communities, you can choose to live a certain way and not necessarily isolate yourself from the crash, not necessarily isolate yourself from the dark ages that are surrounding you, but again, you can be a pocket of success. Number two is you're going to fortify your mind and family. If your family's good, if your mind is good, then your community can be strong. A community of strong individuals that are willing to cooperate with each other is very powerful. But again, the mental state, your individual mental health must be strong. Take the time to get a break. Take the time to revitalize or to read and to learn new ideas. You want to make sure your family's doing well because that's who you're interacting with the majority of the time. And if your family can take care of itself, you don't have to worry about them. You've now created a strong foundation. Number three is you're going to seek relevance over popularity. Yes, I know everyone's trying to be a YouTube influencer. Everybody's trying to have thousands of followers. That is not useful. What it ends up doing is consolidating decision making, and it often puts you in a position where you now have social pressure to act a certain way rather than acting the way that is right. So, for example, what's happening with young girls in social media is they go from being cute to having to be sexy to having to show body parts that would normally make them uncomfortable if you're in a face to face environment, to the point where they're literally selling images of themselves in compromising positions in order to be, quote, popular. So rather than in a small community where somebody might just try to be popular by liking the same music, now they're showing and going beyond what is tasteful or what they would normally do if they didn't have this outside pressure. That's just one example. You want to seek relevance over popularity. It is better for you to be relevant to your community, to have value added to your community, than it is to be popular in your community because, again, popularity comes and goes according to cultural standards. And as a civilization is failing, and I think this dark age is impacting us globally, as a civilization is failing, um, being popular may not have any value. May feel like it, but you don't. Number four, how do you get relevance? Where you cultivate your own mind. There is no need to educate another person about topics of the day. You don't have to educate the other person. You want to focus instead of being competent in your own knowledge. Now, again, I'm somebody doing a podcast who's teaching and trying to share wisdom and answering questions from subscribers and trying to provide something useful to you. But again, I don't care if you learn or don't learn. I'm trying to speak with the people who want to improve their situation, who want to gain wisdom and grow, not the person who's there to argue. That you're not my audience if everything I say you have a conflict about, rather than listening and running it through the filters of critical thinking. So again, you want to cultivate your own mind. And you can do this by reading books, you can read biographies, you can search out answers using a scientific method, and then you're going to be better off than 1,000 other people who are simply following what they are told to do. Are you an independent thinker or are you a slave? Number five, become a producer of value. Rather than consume media, consume goods and services, learn to create surplus value. This is very powerful. So you've formed this alternative community. Now the members of that community are creating surplus value. That improves the quality of that community. It grows the community rather than being popular with this community and attracting other people from the outside. You're cultivating the very best community you can cultivate. You're creating relevance and value. And now you become more stable because you have the surplus elements. So, uh, if you're on the other side of that and you're constantly consuming, you become dependent on the supplier rather than having the flexibility or sustainability of your own activities. So, economic rules work whether or not people understand them. And surplus of value is the only thing that gives you the resources you need to survive conflicts or changes in the market. If you have an economic decline, it never impacts the entire economy. It may put pressure on the entire economy, but there's always some niche somewhere that is doing well. You have to be able to find that niche, and it's always the producers of value. Number six, you want to cultivate what works. Now, this is challenging at times because there is some social pressure here, but it's the most powerful part of this. If you're reading, if you're learning, if you're observing, and you keep your mouth shut, you're going to see things that work really well and you're going to borrow them. Now, you might notice this in my own behavior. I did some research on what is the common energy efficient shelter across multiple time periods, multiple civilizations. So, this is 4D strategic thinking. You're thinking of ideas and concepts not just in the present, but historically, and then forecasting that into the future. I found that the courtyard home was the most universal, and that's something you want to borrow. Same thing with clothing. The same thing with how governments work. There are universal truths that work across civilizations, across cultures, across time periods. It's like the physics of human interaction. These things you want to borrow. Now, again, that cult of personality is going to come out and say that you're culturally appropriating. But again, we are one species of humans, and the culture of one human is the culture of all humans if they so adopt it. So if I see that the neighbor is growing a beautiful garden and they're using a certain method and it works really well, borrowing that what works and cultivating it in my own practices, um, it's irrational for someone to be upset with this. Now, here's the thing to understand. This is a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. You will follow these 6 steps and you will have success despite a dark age, despite clown world, despite failures in other people's behaviors. But if you see someone doing the contrary, for example, consuming goods rather than producing value, don't interrupt them. Let them do that. The way you get the dark ages out of the way is you let parts fail and then they'll run out of resources and then they'll just stop. You do not want to get in there and try to influence people because it takes resources away from the preparation necessary for you to handle these cycles. So after every civilization failure, after every natural disaster, after every major catastrophe or event, there is a period of recovery. If you're trying to recover other people within your own way, within your own belief system, within your religion, whether it's a, a formal religion or it's a modern secular religion, you're wasting resources that could be building up what you have in a way that others would follow it by example. This is a very difficult concept. So we talk about strategic relationships. We're not talking about using our influence and power to shape how other people function. Yeah, it would be great if everybody just did exactly what you told them to do. But what would be better and more stable over time is to lead by example. Be the shining beacon on the hill that people come to, not because you invited them, but because they see the value in it. Now, there are some challenges in this. Folks may come to destroy what you have, but in majority of cases, these 6 factors that I shared here are natural behaviors of successful people. They will see what works and they will borrow it. So when China is having a boom in their economics, if you understand the underlying factors that contribute to that, those factors would apply in the United States and vice versa. Japan mimicked the United States for a period of time and had some success, and we mimicked the Edo period for some period of time and had some success. So, again, success leaves clues, and when the environment around you is failing, you will actually have a rising inequality, a rising bit of cognitive decline, a loss of creativity. These things are real, but it's better to go like the monks and go within, form that alternative community, to cultivate your own mind, to build the mind of your family, to create that place that you've preserved the positive elements of society, the truth about history, and then allow others to come to it as they realize what they're doing is not working. So I know I've covered a lot today. If you have questions about this or any other program, visit us at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Go to the contact page and contact me, Justin Hitt, who I'm editor and publisher of this. And I know this is a difficult topic because it does tend to spread fear, but again, I gave you 6 core elements that if you adopt them will take you out of any dark age or at least allow you to be prosperous during a dark age. But do you recognize these factors? Are you starting to see how these centralized government decisions are actually impacting large numbers of people in ways that they don't even understand? And instead of being frustrated or fearful or concerning the observations that you see, the degradation of society and culture, um, you don't have to participate. You can use strategic relations. You can use the methods that we share on this podcast to set yourself above or beyond these things. And you don't need to let anybody know. You could just do this and have the results and have the benefits, and others can just figure it out on their own. Now, again, building that community, you'll find people on the edge of that community that are well worth cultivating. And you'll find people on the edge of the community that may not believe the same thing you believe, but you can respect their beliefs because they are also building up their own cultural identity or their own movement in the socioeconomic circles. Folks, this is powerful. So, again, if you want me to go into details about how to address this clown world, how to address this dark ages that's here already, it's been here for years. We're only starting to wake up to it. Uh, Definitely go to the website and ask questions. like and subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, but you got to do something, because whether you know it or not, when society collapses, you will be impacted. And my goal is to help my subscribers and my private clients to have minimal impact and maximum results, maximum growth, maximum strength. This is the moment that could transform generations of your family, can help you go to that completely next level. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. If you have questions, you know where to find me. Um, the last thing I want to leave you with is that there is some self discovery and education. And as Nelson Mandela said, if you talk to a man in language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes into his heart. If I've spoken to your heart and you have questions, I'm here to answer them. I sincerely want to answer your questions, because together in this community, we will have success. Thanks for listening.